Let's talk now about some of the more common sections in a technical report and their specific uses. We're going to look at the following: the introduction, the background, the body, which is actually usually multiple sections, and then conclusions or summaries. Beginning with the introduction, what it should do is introduce the report and the project. It is not a place for background information. You're assuming that the reader who is reading the introduction is familiar with the project. What this also means is it's not a place for technical information. You're not going to dive into costing analysis or CAD drawings or anything like that. Normally you're giving context. Who wanted this done and why? What is the purpose for the report? And then what was done? The next thing is, what is in the rest of the report? This is a very important part, and it can be as simple as a paragraph saying, in section 1 we'll be talking about the background, in section 2 we'll be talking about the analysis, and so on. Just one sentence descriptions. What this is for is when someone's not going to read the whole report and doesn't necessarily want to read the table of contents. Not because they don't want to because they're lazy, but because the table of contents might not give enough information. They're going to read that last paragraph to understand what they're about to read and then pick and choose which sections are important. What's key is that the introduction, once you've read it, should give you an understanding that the report contains the following information, and if you were to read it, you'd get a good understanding of it. But the introduction does not contain that information. The background is typically separate from the introduction, although some shorter reports might put the background as a subsection. This contains the minimal information required to understand the rest. That is, if you assume that your reader is a first-year engineer, but they need to know something from second year, you would include that in the background section. How much background to add depends on who your intended audience is. A first-year engineer coming into the fall, for example, so very new, just out of high school, may not have the understanding of calculus they need, and your background might need to be quite extensive. On the other hand, if you're assuming that this first-year engineer is graduating into second year, then they have a significant amount more calculus, and your background section might be very short. Understanding your audience, therefore, is key to making a good background section. Backgrounds should include things like equations or techniques that you're going to use. This is true even if you're assuming that your reader is an expert. They might just forget the equation. Putting it into the background section gives them a handy reference. If you're using a particular set of symbols or methods, then that should also go into the background section. Things that people are likely to forget even if they studied them, or things that might be misinterpreted. Finally, things like physical properties, what people need to know about brittleness or fracture, or, for example, the mass of the system you're looking at. All these things should probably go into the background section. Generally speaking, if it's common to forget, or something that you might not expect your audience to know, put into the background section. It would be very nice if I could tell you that there is a particular set of sections you should be following when writing the body. Unfortunately, it really depends on the type of report you're writing. If you're curious, the MME department at the University of Waterloo has a guideline for your work term reports. Sometimes we follow that in this course, but other times we're not going to be making such an extensive report, and it's up to you to determine what's going into the body and what's not. Usually, though, the body is broken up into two separate parts. The first is an analysis or approach. That is to say, what are we discussing, what are the criteria we're using, and what has to be considered. To give this a little bit more concreteness, let's say that we're talking about where to put a bunch of robots in a factory. The entire report will eventually end with a recommendation on which robots to buy and how they should go in the factory. The analysis might include a description of the factory itself, how big it is, what we need to consider when purchasing a robot. For instance, we might consider the length of the robot, because it's important to be able to reach into a conveyor belt, but the length can't be too large because it may not fit into the corridor. All these discussions are going to be had before we talk about a very specific robot that we're considering. Usually then the body would end with a design or a recommendation. So to continue the example, now is the time to talk about 3 different specific robots we could consider, and then talking about why the first one is the best one to choose. Think of it in terms of, I need to understand what I'm going to be looking at, and then I'm going to have to look at it. And that's how a good body should be organized. Sometimes you're asked to make a conclusions page. Other times you're asked to make a summary. Is there a difference? Conclusions are used when you need the reader to do something based on your report. For instance, if you're doing a failure analysis report or purchasing recommendations, you might want to make a conclusion. You've made a claim. This failure was caused by a bad motor. You then have to have a conclusion. The poor motor number 7 failed because of the following reasons. It's not necessarily appropriate to have a summary at that point, which is really when you need the reader to understand the whole report in context. A summary is used when there aren't really many conclusions to make, or when the conclusions are very obvious. For instance, in a design report. In your design report, you might say, this is the robot we have to buy, or the motor has to be precisely this. That's already covered in the body. You don't need to conclude anything. As a result, you might summarize the whole report. To continue the running example, you might say, first we talked about the factory, and we discussed that length and mass were very important considerations for the robot. We considered 3 separate robots, A, B, and C, and determined that robot A was more important. We should purchase robot A. Sometimes you'll have both the conclusions and summary together, as I just did in that example. The conclusion, we should purchase robot A, came after the summary of the report. Realistically, it doesn't matter to be strict on this, whether you're using conclusions or a summary. What matters is that when you're asked to conclude something, you do it appropriately. Conclusions should be definitive. This is the cause of the accident. Or, your conclusion should be that you don't know. The cause of the accident requires further investigation. The point is that the reader who's reading this report should be able to look at that last page on your report, or last section if it's a very large one, and understand what all of it was leading up to.